Flames. That's the very first thing I saw when I pulled into my driveway that evening. Tall, orange flames licking the sky, dancing wildly where my hard-grown cornfield stood. For a moment, I froze. My entire harvest, the one I had nurtured from spring planting until now, was turning into black ash before my eyes. The air reeked of burning husks, and the crackling sound of destruction filled my ears. And then, through the smoke, I caught a glimpse of her. My neighbor. The one everyone in the neighborhood whispered about. The one people called HOA Karen. She stood by the property line, arms crossed, a smug smirk tugging at her lips, as if she had just taught me a lesson. That was the moment I realized. This wasn't an accident. This was war. If you've ever lived in a neighborhood run by an HOA, a homeowners association, then you know exactly what kind of people seem to thrive there. On paper, HOAs are supposed to keep neighborhoods tidy. Lawns mowed, fences repaired, paint colors approved. But in reality, sometimes those rules attract the type of person who craves power they don't have anywhere else. Someone who treats minor guidelines like federal law. And in our case, that someone was Karen. Now, let me paint you a picture of Karen. Because this woman wasn't just a neighbor. She was practically a suburban dictator. She was in her late 50s, with the kind of permanent scowl lines etched onto her forehead that suggested she had been complaining since birth. You couldn't miss her. Every morning she was out in her yard, sunglasses perched on her head, clipboard in hand like she was running neighborhood boot camp. If a leaf dared fall on your lawn, Karen would spot it. If your garbage bin lid didn't close all the way, she'd photograph it like she was collecting evidence for the FBI. But the real kicker? Karen wasn't even officially in charge of the HOA. That's right, she wasn't the president, treasurer, or secretary. She had no actual title. But she inserted herself into every meeting, spoke louder than everyone else, and bullied her way into being the loudest voice in the room. The HOA board eventually stopped resisting her because, well, it was easier. Imagine a chihuahua that just barks non-stop until you feed it. Karen was the human embodiment of that. At first, I tried to keep the peace. When I moved into the neighborhood, I figured, okay, every community has a nosy neighbor. Just smile and wave, and life goes on. But no, Karen wasn't content with just being nosy. She needed control. The first time I crossed paths with her was about a week after I planted my corn. She marched straight up my driveway, clipboard clutched to her chest, lips pursed so tightly they almost vanished. Without even saying hello, she launched into her script. You know, she said, in that sing-song, passive-aggressive tone. The HOA guidelines say front lawns should be traditional grass landscaping. No farm crops. I smiled, thinking maybe she just didn't understand. Karen, I said gently, the corn's in the backyard. My front lawn is just fine. She blinked, paused, glared, then responded, backyard crops still affect property values. Think of the image of the neighborhood. That was just the beginning. Over the next few months, Karen ramped up her campaign against my little corn patch. She filed complaint after complaint with the HOA. First, it was that my corn was too tall and blocked the view of the fence line. Then she claimed the stalks attracted pests and rodents. When that didn't stick, she insisted that children could injure themselves running into it. You name it, she tried it. Every HOA letter I received had her fingerprints all over it. But here's the thing. My corn was perfectly within the bylaws. There was nothing in writing that outlawed backyard crops. Flowers? Allowed. Vegetable gardens? Allowed. Corn? Technically? Allowed. Karen just didn't like it. And that was enough for her to declare war. What made it worse was the way she rallied other neighbors. Karen had this nasty little talent for spreading whispers like wildfire. I overheard one of them telling another that my cornfield would drive down resale prices. At one meeting, she snidely commented that we're not living in a rural barnyard. People laughed, nervously, but I could tell she was trying to humiliate me publicly into tearing it all down. And listen, I could have given up. I could have mowed it all down and avoided the headache. But that's exactly what Karen wanted, for me to bow. And something in me, maybe stubborn pride, maybe principle, refused. I'd worked too hard, poured too much sweat into that soil. My corn wasn't just food. It was mine. Over time, though, Karen's tactics grew nastier. She started walking her dog by my property repeatedly, allowing it to accidentally wander into my yard. Once she left a written note on my porch that said, "Do the right thing before it becomes a problem you can't control." Creepy, right? It felt less like HOA business and more like a threat. Neighbors started taking sides, too. Some rolled their eyes at her antics, secretly cheering me on for standing my ground. Others, especially the ones who were too afraid to get on Karen's bad side, started avoiding me, probably hoping she wouldn't target them next. You could practically feel the tension whenever we all crossed paths. And Karen? She thrived off it. She strutted around with this attitude of untouchable authority, like she was the sheriff and we were all her townsfolk. If I threw a cookout, she'd pop her head over the fence to remind me about HOA noise regulations. If I had packages arrive that sat outside a little too long, she'd snap pictures. Literally, she took photos of my Amazon boxes. To her, nothing was too small. Looking back, it was obvious where things were heading. Karen was the kind of person who hated losing. The more I resisted her so-called rules, the more determined she became. She didn't just see my cornfield as an inconvenience. It represented the one thing in the neighborhood she couldn't control. And for someone addicted to that sense of power, that must have driven her up the wall. At the time, though, I couldn't have guessed how far she'd go. I chalked it up to her being bossy, overbearing, maybe even miserable in her own life. But deep down, Karen was simmering. And like a pot on the stove left unattended, it was only a matter of time before she boiled over, with flames that would scorch more than just my corn. There are certain moments in life that etch themselves into your memory so sharply, you remember every smell, every sound, every flicker of light around you. For me, that moment was the day the fire came. It was a Friday. I remember that because I'd been slogging through the end of a painfully long work week. The kind where you sit at your desk watching the clock, fantasizing about the weekend. And you know what I was fantasizing about? My corn. Not vacation. Not drinks. Not even sleep. My cornfield had become my pride and joy. That golden, towering sea of stalks represented months of effort. Sweat, patience, early mornings, and late nights. Soon, it was harvest time. I imagined roasting some that weekend, handing out baskets to my friends and neighbors. Well, maybe not Karen, and finally seeing my hard work pay off. I turned onto my street that evening, window cracked, my playlist humming along. At first, I noticed what looked like a faint haze in the distance. You know how sometimes in summer the air shimmers with heat waves rising off the road? That's what I thought it was. Until my gut told me otherwise. The haze was thicker, blacker, and it was coming from my backyard. The pit of my stomach fell out. Panic surged as I floored the gas pedal. My tires screeched against the pavement. And when I whipped into my driveway, I saw it. Flames. My entire field of corn, my harvest, my dream, was a wall of fire. It wasn't a small, controllable burn either. It was raging. The sound was deafening, like hundreds of crumpled papers tossed into a campfire all at once. Stalks snapped as they fell, sending glowing embers spiraling upward. Smoke clawed into the sky, thick and black, carrying with it the charred stench of burnt husks. For a few seconds, I was frozen. Shock will do that to you. One moment I was picturing corn on a family dinner table. The next moment I was staring at ashes where those meals would never happen. My chest tightened. My eyes watered, partly from smoke, partly from heartbreak. Then I saw her. Karen. Of course. She stood at the edge of my property, arms crossed over her chest like a judge watching the execution of a sentence. On her face, that same tight-lipped smirk I'd seen too many times before. Except this time, it wasn't about a missed trash pickup or a miscolored shutter. This time, she looked satisfied, almost smug. And in her hand, of all things, was her cell phone. Not dialing 911, not holding up to her ear. Just dangling casually in her grip while orange light flickered across her sunglasses. When her eyes caught mine, she didn't look ashamed. She didn't look apologetic. She looked triumphant. Like this was the moment she had finally won. The rage that boiled inside me was hotter than the fire itself. I shouted, "What did you do?" But my voice cracked, swallowed by the roar of the flames. Did she even hear me? If she did, she didn't care. Because instead of scrambling to help, instead of grabbing a hose, she yelled something across the smoke-choked gap. This is what happens when you don't follow the rules. The audacity nearly knocked me over harder than the heat from the flames did. Was she admitting it openly? Or taunting me while the corn burned? Either way, there was no mistaking it. This wasn't just some freak accident. This wasn't a tossed cigarette from a careless driver or sparks from power lines overhead. No, this looked deliberate. And Karen was here to watch it happen. My mind raced. Should I charge at her? Yell? Grab my own hose? But one glance showed me it was too late for that. The fire had already spread wide, stalks collapsing into smoldering heaps. By the time I'd drag out a garden hose, the flames would have swallowed half my yard. All I could do was watch and call for backup. So I snapped into motion, fumbling my phone from my pocket with trembling hands, punching in 911. My voice shook as I gave the dispatcher my address. My field, my backyard is on fire. Hurry! Neighbors began spilling out of their houses, alarm washing across their faces as they saw the towering inferno. I could hear shouts. Oh my God! What happened? The whole street gathered, some filming on their phones, others grabbing buckets that wouldn't help against something this massive. People stared at the fire and then at Karen, who still hadn't lifted a finger to help. That was when the faint wail of sirens began to pierce through the chaos. Fire trucks. Help was on the way. Relief tried to creep in, but it tangled badly with another emotion simmering inside me. Anger. Not just over the loss of my harvest. Not just over the weeks, months of effort erased in smoke. But because I knew who was responsible. She was standing right there, looking smug while my dreams went up in flames. And here's the detail that still haunts me. By the time I saw firefighters racing toward the blaze, hoses spraying water into the smoke, I caught one last glimpse of Karen. That smug smirk was still there, but for the briefest flicker of a second, I noticed something else. Doubt. It passed over her face just long enough to tell me she hadn't thought this part through. The fire was no longer just between me and her. It was now a spectacle, the whole neighborhood watching, the authorities arriving, the truth lingering in the air like the smoke itself. And in that moment, I realized, Karen thought she'd won the battle. But she had just stepped onto a battlefield she wasn't prepared to face. The wailing of sirens cut through the chaos like a knife, sharp and insistent, growing louder with every second. Standing at the edge of my driveway, I felt a surge of relief. Fire trucks were coming. Real heroes in heavy gear. People who wouldn't just stand with their arms crossed while my livelihood turned to ash. And then they appeared. A blur of flashing red lights, gurgling engines, and the spurt of hydraulics as the trucks screeched to a halt in front of my house. It was like watching an army arrive. Firefighters jumped down, their boots slamming against the pavement, each one moving with the kind of speed and precision you only see in people who drill for chaos every single day. Everyone back. Back from the fire, one barked as if he was in command of a battlefield. In seconds, hoses snapped into place, gleaming snakes unfurling as water blasted from the metal nozzles. Powerful streams cut through the smoke, hissing as they collided with the flames. The corn crackled in protest, but inch by inch, the fire lost ground against the surge of water. Neighbors gasped and pointed, shielding their faces as steam washed over us. You'd think that onlookers might retreat into safety, but no, the entire street had come out to witness this drama. Eyes kept darting between the flames and, inevitably, to Karen. And here's where things started to get interesting. One firefighter moved toward me. His mask dangled around his neck, his eyes sharp as he shouted over the roar. Anyone know how this fire started? It was an ordinary question. Standard procedure. But the silence that followed wasn't ordinary at all. because all at once, the neighbors looked at her. Karen. She must have felt the weight of it. Dozens of eyes pinning her in place as if the suspicion hung heavier than the smoke itself. She raised her eyebrows, trying to act confused, like she was some innocent bystander. "Oh, I don't know," she stammered. "I was just walking, and then I saw it." It would have sounded believable, maybe, if her hands weren't trembling slightly, if her voice didn't betray nervous cracks, and if she hadn't spent months railing on about how that cornfield was a disgrace to the HOA. The firefighter tilted his head, clearly not convinced. He crouched low, scanning the charred ground near the fence line, inspecting where flames licked the soil. Then he glanced back at Karen's garden. His eyes lingered on her hose, still rolled up, bone dry, like she never even thought to use it. Another firefighter, a woman with soot streaking her helmet, reported what she'd observed. Fire seems to have started in multiple patches. Not one continuous spread. Very unusual. Her words cut through the murmuring crowd like a blade. Multiple patches? That meant someone had set it intentionally. It wasn't just dry grass igniting from one spark. This was deliberate. Karen's lips curled into a shaky smile. "Well, maybe, kids? Kids could have done it," she offered, looking around desperately for backup. But nobody spoke up for her. In fact, I saw more than one neighbor pulling out their phones to hit record. Karen, the self-appointed HOA sheriff, suddenly had an audience she didn't want. And then came the reveal. One firefighter walked closer to Karen, squinting at something on her hands. He said, motioning politely but firmly. "Could you hold up your gloves?" Her face paled. Slowly, almost unwillingly, she raised her hands. And there it was, those bright garden gloves she'd always worn. Except tonight they had black smudges streaking across the fingertips, ash clinging stubbornly to the fabric like evidence begging to be noticed. The crowd erupted in whispers. "Is she serious? Oh my God, was it her?" Karen pulled her hands back quickly, stuffing them behind her. "I was just, weeding earlier," she said loudly, too loudly, her voice jittering out of control. "I always do yard work." But you could see it in everyone's eyes. Nobody was buying it. Not the neighbors, not me, not the firefighters standing in their heavy coats, hoses still spraying down the last stubborn cracks of flame. One firefighter asked the question flat out, without sugarcoating, "Are you saying you were in your garden, while a fire started right next door?" Karen froze. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. She looked like a fish plucked from water, gasping for a story that wasn't there. The smug, untouchable HOA queen everyone hated? For the first time in years, she looked rattled. I could almost see the calculation in her head. Stick to her lies and hope for the best, or point the finger somewhere else. And she chose the latter. "This is his fault," she shrieked suddenly, whipping her finger toward me. "He probably did it for insurance money. Yes, that's right. He set it himself and now he's trying to blame me because he knows the HOA has rules. He planted corn illegally. This whole thing is his fault." The crowd gasped, half in disbelief, half in disgust. Even the firefighters frowned. One of them calmly asked me to step aside while they questioned her further, but not before Karen doubled down. She began ranting, sputtering accusations faster than anyone could keep up with. But the more she talked, the deeper she dug her hole. Her words weren't organized, and her excuses contradicted themselves. And then came the nail in the coffin. Mid-rant, flushed red from yelling, she blurted out the line that hit everyone like a thunderclap. "Well, maybe if he had just gotten rid of it like I told him, I wouldn't have had to do this." Silence. Dead silence. Smoke curled overhead, hoses hissed, but nobody spoke. Every single head turned toward Karen with wide eyes. She had just said the quiet part out loud. Confession, disguised as justification. Her hand flew to her mouth as if she wanted to shove the words back in, but it was too late. The damage was done. And while the last embers of my cornfield sputtered under the heavy spray of water, something else in that moment was burning down. Karen's iron grip on the neighborhood. If Section 4 was the moment Karen slipped, Section 5 was the moment she spiraled. Because once that single damning sentence left her mouth, once she practically admitted she'd set the fire, there was no stuffing it back in. The silence after her outburst stretched like a rubber band about to snap. You could almost hear the collective gasp from the neighborhood. Even the firefighters froze mid-step, eyes narrowing on her, their faces lit by the eerie glow of the final smoldering flames. Karen's cheeks flushed crimson. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again like she was about to clarify, but nothing she said could unsay those words. And that's when it started. "I didn't mean it like that," she cried, her voice pitching higher, teetering on hysteria. "What I meant was, well, obviously this is all his fault. He shouldn't have planted corn in the first place. None of this would have happened if he just followed the HOA guidelines." Her words tumbled over each other, desperate, chaotic. And yet, every excuse just dug her deeper. Neighbors, once quiet shadows hiding from her scrutiny, now began whispering aloud. She admitted it. Did she really say what I think she said? She lit it. She had to. The power dynamic had flipped, and you could practically feel the fear radiating from her. 4 years, Karen had stood as the self-appointed judge of the neighborhood. Now, she was on trial, in front of everyone. One firefighter calmly pulled out a notepad, jotting down details like a detective might at a crime scene. Another, the fire marshal, cleared his throat. It's best you stop speaking until law enforcement arrives." But Karen was too far gone to stop. She waved her arms wildly, pacing, her voice growing more shrill. "This whole thing is a setup. A setup. You hear me? He wanted this fire. He wants insurance money. And you all," she whirled on the gawking crowd, "you've all been brainwashed into thinking I'm the bad guy." If this had been a play, it would have been a tragic performance. Except it wasn't tragic. It was pitiful. You could see it in the neighbors' expressions. People who once cowered under the weight of her HOA complaints now looked at her with something new, contempt. And the more Karen saw those looks, the more frantic she became. She started shouting random evidence to defend herself, her words laced with paranoia. "Check his garage. He probably has gasoline cans. He's trying to frame me. Why would I set the fire when I was standing right there? That would make me the dumbest arsonist in history. He hates me because I actually care about the neighborhood." She was unraveling completely. And then came the most desperate moment of all. Karen bolted toward one of the firefighters holding out a scorched husk of corn as though it were Exhibit A in a courtroom. She jabbed a finger at it, screaming, "Look at this. Look. You think that's my fault? Corn burns. That's what it does. Corn is dangerous. Dangerous." She was seriously blaming my backyard crops for somehow igniting themselves. The crowd couldn't hold it in anymore. A ripple of laughter broke through, low at first, then growing. Not amused laughter, but the cruel kind of chuckle that echoes when someone truly humiliates themselves. Karen whipped her head around, her eyes darting from face to face, realizing what she'd lost in that moment wasn't just her composure. It was her control. The fear she thrived on had dissolved. And once the neighbors stopped fearing her, she had nothing left. I wish I could say I felt victorious standing there. But the truth was, I was still numb. My corn, my months of work, lay black and ruined on the ground. The flames were gone, but they'd taken so much with them. Still, somewhere beneath that grief, a small ember of satisfaction burned. If Karen thought she'd teach me a lesson, she was watching it backfire spectacularly. The firefighters, now nearly finished with the last hot spots, began cordoning off the area with tape. An officer arrived on the scene, jotting in his notebook as neighbors crowded behind him, feeding him every detail they'd heard Karen say. Yeah, she was here before anyone else. She said it was his fault, then admitted, you know what she said. Look at her gloves. Check her gloves. Karen's voice fractured into sobs then, her bravado gone. She tried to switch tactics, pleading instead of raging. She tugged on the officer's sleeve. Please. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. I only wanted to improve property values. I didn't mean for it to. Her voice broke entirely. For the first time in years, Karen didn't sound like the HOA enforcer. She sounded frightened. Small. Exposed. But here's the thing about power. When you base it only on fear, it never lasts. The moment your victims stop shaking, you're just another person. And in Karen's case, a person who just confessed to a crime in front of a dozen witnesses and half a fire department. As the officer gently but firmly guided her aside, reading her rights, the neighbors erupted again. Not laughter this time, but a collective murmur of disbelief mixed with relief. For years, Karen had been their tormentor. Now she was just another headline waiting to happen. And standing there, watching her meltdown spiral to its bitter end, I couldn't help thinking one simple thought. Karen had set the fire to destroy me, but in the end, she'd only burned herself. It's amazing how quiet the world feels after chaos. After the shouting, the sirens, the roaring flames, when it all finally faded, my backyard was silent. Well, almost silent. There was the occasional hiss as water dripped from what was left of the blackened corn stalks, steam curling upward into the night air. My once vibrant backyard harvest was nothing but ash and smoke, the earth scarred, the air heavy with the acrid scent of destruction. But while the fire had taken my crop, it had revealed something Karen could never control: the truth. Karen stood off to the side, her arms pinned awkwardly behind her by an officer as he patiently read her rights. The scene was surreal. The woman who once strutted around the block wielding HOA rules like a sword was now sweaty, disheveled, mascara streaked down her cheeks, her voice cracking as she stammered excuses. "Wait, I didn't mean that," she whimpered to the officer. "You're twisting my words. I was just frustrated. I didn't do it. I was only joking." But the officer didn't flinch. He'd probably heard every excuse in the book, and Karen's "just kidding about arson" defense wasn't exactly going to make it into legal textbooks. The neighbors, meanwhile, had gathered in clusters along the sidewalk, whispering like theatergoers after a show. Only this wasn't entertainment. This was real. You could see it in their eyes. A mix of shock, disbelief, and something else, relief. Years of her intimidation had just evaporated. The boogeyman had been unmasked, and she was just human. A human with a lot of explaining to do in court. I'll never forget Mrs. Green, the sweet old lady down the street who Karen once fined repeatedly for putting her trash cans out 10 minutes too early. She leaned toward me, patted my arm, and whispered, "It's over now, dear. She can't hurt anyone anymore." And she was right. As the officers escorted Karen toward the waiting squad car, a hush fell across the crowd. Everyone expected her to go quietly, but of course, Karen wasn't capable of surrendering dignity gracefully. She twisted her head over her shoulder, screaming back at us like a villain in the final act of a bad play. "You'll regret this. All of you. The neighborhood will fall apart without me. You need me." No one responded. That was somehow louder than shouting back. The silence from her subjects was the ultimate rejection. She kicked her feet as they tucked her into the car, her voice muffling behind the glass, until the red and blue lights painted her house one last time before disappearing down the street. That was the night Karen lost her crown and her kingdom. The days that followed felt different, strange at first. The neighborhood, once tense and suffocating under Karen's iron grip, felt lighter, open. People actually stopped to talk to each other. Smiles replaced those guilty when caught glances. And slowly, we all started piecing things back together. Both my burned field and the fractured spirit of the street. Neighbors came to my door carrying casseroles, flower pots, pies. And then one morning, I woke up to hammering and voices in my backyard. I rushed outside, and what did I find? Mr. Patel and his sons tilling the soil. The Wright family unloading seedlings from their car. Even Mrs. Green showed up, carrying a tray of tomato sprouts she'd grown on her windowsill. "We figured we'd help you replant," one of them said, smiling. And just like that, what Karen had tried to destroy became something bigger. No longer just my cornfield. Soon, my backyard transformed into a shared community garden. It wasn't perfect, certainly not uniform, and definitely not HOA brochure material. But it was beautiful. Rows of corn sprouting alongside tomatoes, squash curling around beans, peppers adding flashes of color. Kids ran between the rows playing tag while parents worked side by side in the dirt. The irony was delicious. Karen had threatened that my cornfield would destroy property values. But when the garden flourished, when the neighborhood became this vibrant, happy place where people bonded, I swear, the whole community suddenly looked more appealing to anyone who passed by. At the next HOA meeting, yes, they still held them, though with much less dictatorship. The conversation was almost unrecognizable. Instead of Karen rattling off fines or issuing citations, people laughed, shared ideas, and voted to make backyard gardens officially encouraged. Imagine that. An HOA where people actually supported individuality rather than crushed it. Karen, of course, wasn't there. By then, she had lawyered up, her house sitting on the market with the for sale sign glaring like a scarlet letter. Nobody in the neighborhood shed a tear when her moving van eventually pulled away weeks later. And me? Well, when I walk into my yard now, I still think about that night. I still remember the flames, the crackling of stalks disintegrating into powder, the bitter stomach drop I felt seeing my hard work destroyed. But now, when I look at the lush rows of crops, not just mine, but everyone's, those memories sting a little less. Because out of the ashes of my corn, something more powerful grew, a community. Karen thought she could tear me down, isolate me, scare me into submission. But in the end, she inspired the exact opposite. The neighborhood didn't collapse without her, it thrived. Fear had kept us apart, but her downfall brought us together. And so, every time I harvest corn now, every golden ear I peel open, every meal I share with a neighbor at a community cookout by the garden, I remember. I smile a little wider. Because what grew wasn't just food. What grew was resilience, laughter, and stubborn proof that no HOA Karen in the world can burn down the spirit of people who stand together. She tried to torch my future. Instead, she only lit the spark that built something better.